It all started innocently enough with four friends, Jake, Sarah, Mike, and Emily, deciding to spend a weekend at Blackwood Forest. The forest was infamous for strange tales whispered among locals, stories of disappearances and strange lights. But like most urban legends, the friends brushed it off, laughing at the idea of ghosts haunting the woods. They were young, adventurous, and wanted an escape from the drudgery of their everyday lives. Arriving late in the evening, the four parked their car at the edge of Blackwood Forest. The last traces of sunlight were slipping away, casting long shadows over the ground, and a dense mist crept outward from the trees as if welcoming them in. The forest felt alive somehow, almost aware of their presence. But they shrugged it off, hoisting their backpacks and entering the eerie quiet of the woods. There was no breeze, yet the mist seemed to move, drifting over the ground in a way that felt unnatural, like invisible hands guiding it. Jake, ever the skeptic, smirked, dismissing the ominous atmosphere as nothing more than typical forest stuff, while Emily, always the cautious one, hesitated, glancing back at the car as if considering the possibility of staying behind. "Come on, Emily, it's just a forest," Jake teased, grinning. But Emily could only manage a nervous smile as they ventured in. The hike to their campsite took longer than expected. Each step deeper into the forest seemed to amplify an unsettling silence that made the group feel isolated, as though the forest was swallowing the sounds around them. The birdsong had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. "I think we're close to the spot," Mike finally said, pointing to a small clearing just ahead. Relief washed over them as they set down their bags, ready to set up their tents before it got too dark. As they worked, their voices sounded strangely muted, absorbed by the dense trees surrounding them. The towering pines seemed to press inward, creating an impenetrable wall around the clearing. Jake whistled to break the silence, chuckling when Sarah jumped. "Scared already, Sarah?" he teased. She threw a handful of dry leaves at him, laughing nervously, but something in her eyes hinted at a genuine unease. It took longer than expected, but they finally had their camp set up. 2 tents, a makeshift circle for a fire, and all their belongings organized into neat piles. Jake lit the fire as Emily arranged stones around it, keeping her eyes on the shadows that danced just beyond the light. A sense of foreboding hung in the air. The forest had felt strange since the moment they entered, and now, as the firelight flickered against the darkness, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They gathered around the fire, relaxing for the first time since entering the forest. The conversation started light, with jokes and teasing, but gradually drifted to the folklore surrounding Blackwood Forest. Jake, who was always quick to dismiss supernatural stories, laughed as Mike recounted an old tale he'd heard of a ghostly woman who wandered these woods. "They say she's looking for her lost child," Mike said, his tone mocking. "And if you hear her calling out for him, don't answer, or she'll think you took him and follow you home." The others laughed, but their laughter faltered as a gust of wind suddenly rushed through the clearing. The fire flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows across their faces. And then, just as abruptly, the wind stopped. Complete silence followed, more oppressive than before, as though something was waiting for them to make a sound. And then they heard it, a faint, almost melodic whisper carried by another gust of wind. It was soft, too quiet to understand, but the cadence sounded disturbingly human. Emily felt her heart race as the whispering continued, barely audible yet unmistakably real. Sarah gripped her arm, her eyes wide with fear. Jake tried to make a joke, claiming it was just the wind, but his voice wavered. The tension grew as the hours ticked by, each minute marked by an unbearable silence. Just as they were beginning to calm down, a sound broke the stillness, a soft, crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. They held their breath, glancing at one another, each wondering if the others heard it too. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, circling their campsite as though someone or something was observing them. Emily's face turned pale as she whispered, "Did you hear that?" Jake nodded, his expression no longer mocking. He strained his ears, trying to place the sound, but it seemed to move around them, fading and then growing louder again, as if the source were constantly shifting. The footsteps continued, each crunch of leaves sending a chill down their spines. They tried shining their flashlights into the darkness, but the light barely penetrated the dense trees, revealing nothing but the silent, mist-covered ground. Sarah gripped Mike's hand tightly, her breathing shallow. "Let's just get back to the tents," she whispered, her voice trembling. They retreated, unwilling to admit out loud the fear tightening their throats, yet none of them dared to close their eyes once inside their tents. Time in the dead of night, when the fire had burned low, Sarah awoke with a start. She sat up, straining to hear what had disturbed her. The forest was utterly silent, an unnatural, suffocating stillness that felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. Then she saw it, a figure, faint and ethereal, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was a woman, or at least something that resembled one. Her form was slightly transparent, dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned gown. Her face was pale, almost glowing in the moonlight, and her eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to absorb all light around them. Sarah felt her throat tighten, unable to scream, as the figure's gaze seemed to lock onto hers. The others slowly stirred, each one gasping as they caught sight of the apparition. The woman didn't move, but a sense of pure malice radiated from her. Her empty eyes held them in place, and her lips parted as though she were about to speak. But no sound came, only an intense, suffocating silence as she continued to stare, her expression unreadable yet deeply unsettling. The friends bolted to their feet, adrenaline overriding their terror. They ran blindly through the forest, the cold air stinging their lungs as branches clawed at their skin. But no matter how fast they ran, the apparition seemed to follow, gliding silently just beyond the trees, her expression cold and unchanging. The forest itself felt like it was closing in around them. Every path they took seemed to lead them back to the clearing, each familiar tree and rock making them feel as though they were trapped in a never-ending maze. Panic set in as they realized they couldn't escape. The apparition's hollow eyes remained fixed on them, no closer, yet no further away. Emily stumbled, falling to her knees as the others pulled her back to her feet. "Please, just go without me," she begged, but they wouldn't leave her behind. They pulled her along, but deep down, each of them knew there was no outrunning whatever haunted these woods. At last, they stumbled into a small clearing, panting and exhausted. They turned, expecting to see the apparition close behind, but there was only silence. They collapsed to the ground, their breaths ragged as they tried to make sense of what had happened. Then, without warning, the apparition appeared, standing in the center of the clearing, closer than ever before. Jake, his voice quivering, demanded to know what it wanted, his voice a desperate echo in the silence. The woman lifted a single hand, pointing into the darkness beyond the clearing. Her expression remained blank, yet something about her gesture felt like an accusation. And then, in an instant, she vanished. The silence lifted, leaving them alone in the clearing, yet each of them knew they'd been marked by her. They could feel it, a lingering dread, as if she'd left a part of herself with them. When dawn finally broke, they found their way back to the car, silent and haunted by what they'd experienced. The sunlight felt surreal, as if they were returning to a world that had no idea what horrors lay hidden in Blackwood Forest. They piled into the car, each too shaken to speak, too afraid to look back. The drive home was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts, replaying the night's events. They knew they would never speak of what happened, but the memory of the apparition would follow them, lingering like a shadow. Whatever they had encountered in Blackwood Forest wasn't bound by logic, and each of them knew they had glimpsed something that wasn't meant for human eyes. They didn't say it aloud, but the message was clear. They would never return to Blackwood Forest. Whatever haunted those woods had marked them, and they would carry that terror with them forever.